Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage of another SpaceX launch from Florida's Space Coast. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40, where a Falcon 9 rocket is awaiting liftoff this morning at 7:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:10 UTC. This mission will be deploying a navigation satellite, a GPS satellite for the United States Space Force, and it comes just 3 days after SpaceX's previous mission for the Space Force that occurred on Sunday evening from here at Kennedy Space Center using a Falcon Heavy rocket. So another national security launch on tap this morning, Wednesday morning, here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. We're now about 53 minutes from the opening of this morning's launch window. The weather conditions here in Florida appear to be ideal for liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. SpaceX teams are monitoring wind and sea conditions downrange off to the northeast, where a drone ship is holding position for landing of the first stage booster around 8 minutes after liftoff. There is a moderate risk of some unfavorable conditions in that area for recovery of the booster. So that'll be a watch item throughout the rest of the countdown, but the weather conditions here locally in Florida look to be good, look to be go for liftoff this morning. It's a rather crisp morning with calm winds and clear skies here on Florida's Space Coast. Off in the background, you're seeing one of the security helicopters, likely a Coast Guard chopper, patrolling the offshore waters, making sure that there are no boats or any vessels in the restricted waters of the Atlantic Ocean that have been cleared to allow this morning's launch to proceed safely. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of propellant loading. That'll be coming at T-minus 35 minutes, about 16 and a half minutes from now. Before then, we hope to hear some call-outs from SpaceX Launch Control on the outcome of the pre-launch readiness poll. That's an electronic poll that the SpaceX launch team will be performing coming up in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. And if all parameters are go, technical and weather, the team will proceed into propellant loading this morning at T-minus 35 minutes, on track for liftoff at the top of this morning's launch window at 7:10 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, SpaceX has 15 minutes of launch window to work with today. Assuming that was all coming through. The dial's definitely down. SpaceX's countdown now at T-minus 42 minutes, 42 seconds. You're seeing some of the first light on the horizon as we're now about 50 minutes or so from sunrise here on Florida's Space Coast. This launch will be occurring just a few minutes before local sunrise here in Central Florida. So it could be another spectacular launch. If you tuned in on Sunday evening, that launch of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy occurred just a few minutes after sunset. And we expect to have similar lighting conditions here on Florida Space Coast this morning, although it'll be just a few minutes before sunrise. And with this launch heading out toward the northeast over the Atlantic Ocean, the rocket will be ascending into sunlight just a few moments after liftoff, and that should illuminate the exhaust plume and some of the ice crystals that form from the exhaust plume in the upper atmosphere, and should create quite a spectacle for those of you watching here in the local area or perhaps even up the east coast of the United States. This launch could be visible from the Carolinas all the way up to the mid-Atlantic states if you have clear skies this morning.
This is Launch Active Countdown Net. Reminder, step 56.69, propellant load and launch go, no-go polls open for your buy at this time.
And now we're getting some updates from SpaceX Launch Control, just as we had expected at this point in the countdown. So that pre-launch readiness poll is now underway to confirm that all stations are ready for propellant loading and launch. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live shot of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. If you click the thumbs up button or the like button, that'll help us gain a larger audience for our coverage. That'll really help us out. If you haven't done so yet, please do so. We're now about 5 minutes away from the start of propellant loading, assuming that this pre-launch readiness poll does result in a go for launch.
This is Launch Active Countdown Net. We're going to adjust the T0 time to allow additional time for spacecraft team to resolve an issue. We're setting up for a new T0 time of 12:24:00. RC and ground stations, would you please go coordinate that with our partners?
RC copies. Ground stations copies.
And you just heard an update from SpaceX Launch Control. The launch time is being adjusted this morning to the end of the window. That's going to be at 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:24 UTC. This will allow some time for the spacecraft team to resolve an issue according to SpaceX Launch Control. So this is an issue with the GPS spacecraft or some sort of associated system with that spacecraft, and the teams are working to now resolve that issue. We don't know what the issue is, but it is a payload concern, and SpaceX is adjusting the timeline this morning to now target the end of the window at 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:24 UTC.
LD, this is RC on countdown 1.
LD.
Range has verified COLA for 122400.
They verified they can support? Okay, thank you.
Correct, they verified they could support.
Again, if you're just joining us, the launch time this morning has been delayed by 14. If you're just joining us, the launch time this morning has been delayed by 14 minutes to 12:24 UTC or 7:24 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This 14-minute delay pushes the launch time nearly to the end of this morning's 15-minute launch window. This will allow time, according to SpaceX Launch Control, for spacecraft teams to resolve an issue. So some sort of issue involving the payload, the GPS satellite on board the Falcon 9 rocket this morning. And the teams are just taking some extra time to try to resolve that issue before entering into the final 35-minute countdown sequence. That's when the countdown will be handed over to a ground computer, and a sequencer will take over to oversee the final 35 minutes of the countdown. The main events during that 35-minute sequence will be the loading of kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket. As you can see, it's a beautiful morning here in Central Florida with some orange now apparent on the eastern horizon. This view comes from Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles away from Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 rocket is awaiting liftoff this morning. And the camera is looking pretty much due east. And we expect the sun to rise somewhere near the pad, just behind the pad, shortly after, around 7:15 a.m. Eastern Time, shortly before the new target launch time. Now 42 minutes, 35 seconds until the new target launch time for SpaceX this morning. About 7.5 minutes remaining until the time at which SpaceX should begin loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. just to recap, the new launch time is 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time. Now 39 minutes, 10 seconds until the new target launch time. As you can see, it's a beautiful morning here on Florida Space Coast. Some patchy low ground fog now visible between our location and the Launch Complex 40 area, but no issues with any visibility this morning. Clear skies overhead. We're just waiting on an update from SpaceX on whether the teams will be proceeding into propellant loading this morning. We know the spacecraft team is working an issue associated with the GPS spacecraft on top of the Falcon 9 rocket. That caused a 14-minute delay from the original target launch time of 7:10 a.m. Eastern Time. Liftoff is now set for 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time, near the end of this morning's 15-minute launch window.
On countdown net, poll is complete. We'll go for propellant loading and launch.
And we did just hear the update from SpaceX Launch Control that the team has completed their pre-launch poll and the team is now go for propellant loading and launch. So the countdown will be proceeding this morning toward an updated target launch time of 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time or 12:24 UTC. Propellant loading should get underway in about 2.5 minutes time. If you're just joining us and you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this sunrise launch to as many people as possible. Again, this launch should be visible across a wide swath of Florida, as well as potentially up the east coast of the United States. If you have clear skies, you have a chance of seeing this rocket as it climbs into orbit. Again, with this 14-minute launch delay, the liftoff of the Falcon 9 will now be occurring around 8 minutes
Countdown. A
after
reminder on
sunrise.
abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief CE or LD, and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto. T-minus 10 seconds, launch control be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Launch auto sequence has started.
The countdown just passed T-minus 35 minutes, and the launch auto sequence is now underway. So the countdown is now in the control of a ground launch sequencer computer, and propellant loading is now underway. So SpaceX has begun the process of loading about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40. That propellant loading process will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes. That's when the tanks will be all filled for flight, and the fill and drain valves will be closed at that point. The final tanks to be filled will be liquid oxygen. Kerosene tanks will be actually filled before that time in the countdown. Right now, 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 are being loaded. The first stage is being loaded with kerosene and liquid oxygen, and the upper stage is also being loaded with kerosene at this time. Liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage won't start until about T-minus 16 minutes later in the countdown. The liquid oxygen is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero. It's actually densified near its freezing point. That allows SpaceX to essentially cram more molecules of oxidizer and fuel into the Falcon 9 propellant tanks. That gives the Falcon 9 an increase, a boost in performance, and helps ensure that the rocket's first stage has enough reserve propellant to make its propulsive maneuvers to return to landing. This morning, the landing will be occurring offshore on a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, T-minus 30 minutes, 22 seconds and counting. Let's talk a little bit about the payload for this mission. This will be the 6th satellite in the Space Force's series of GPS-3 satellites. This satellite is known as GPS-3 Space Vehicle 6, or GPS-3 SV06. And it was built by Lockheed Martin at their satellite manufacturing facility near Denver, Colorado. It's based on Lockheed Martin's LM2100 satellite bus. On the right side of your screen, this image is a file photo actually from the encapsulation of a previous GPS-3 satellite inside the payload fairing of a Falcon 9 rocket. But these satellites are all virtually identical, and the Falcon 9 payload fairing that's flying this morning looks very much the same as the one you're seeing here as well. So this is what the satellite looks like buttoned up in launch configuration. According to the Space Force, the launch weight of this spacecraft is 9,595 pounds. That's about 4.35 metric tons. That's including the propellant that's actually loaded onto the vehicle, onto the spacecraft, that's necessary for in-orbit maneuvers after the spacecraft separates from the Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 will be deploying the spacecraft into an elliptical transfer orbit with an apogee or high point about 12,550 miles or 20,200 kilometers, a low point a few thousand miles above the Earth. And then the spacecraft, after deploying from the Falcon 9 about 90 minutes into the flight, will use its onboard propulsion over the next few days to few weeks to circularize its orbit at the operational altitude for the GPS constellation at 12,550 miles at an inclination of 55 degrees to the equator. This spacecraft has a design life of 15 years, so this new generation of GPS-3 satellites have longer lifetimes, and they also add a new L-band navigation signal called the L1C that's interoperable with the international global navigation services such as the European GLONASS network. So users with a hand terminal, such as in their smartphone, can actually receive signals from both GPS satellites and European GLONASS satellites, and the system works by triangulation, essentially using multiple satellites in the sky to triangulate a user's position, and the more satellites that a user can connect to and receive signals from, the more precise their position and time estimate will be. So by combining the GPS and the Galileo systems together, the users can receive a more precise position estimate. And that's one of the new innovations with the GPS-3 series satellites, is the interoperability with the European Galileo system and the GPS system as well. Here's a look at the countdown timeline this morning. We've already passed a few of these milestones with the start of propellant loading. That was confirmed at T-minus 35 minutes. Looking ahead later into the countdown, the second stage of the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with kerosene fuel at about T-minus 20 minutes and 30 seconds or so. And then a few moments later, we expect to see what we know as the big vent from the strongback. That's going to be a plume of oxygen gas, gaseous oxygen, coming from the strongback out at pad 40 to purge and chill some transfer lines that lead up the strongback for the loading of liquid oxygen onto stage 2. That'll begin at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9's Merlin 1D engines will be chilled down for ignition. This is a thermal conditioning process that involves flowing small amounts of liquid oxygen through the engine plumbing to condition those components for the more rapid flow of oxidizer at engine startup. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the kerosene tank on the first stage should be confirmed fully loaded. At T-minus 4.5 minutes, the strongback will begin retracting from the Falcon 9 rocket to an intermediate angle of about 1.5 degrees. We'll see that in this camera view. We hope to see that strongback recline just about 1.5 degrees at that point in the countdown. At liftoff, the strongback mast will actually recline down to about 45 degrees to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to clear the tower. At T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be complete. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will be handed over to the Falcon 9's onboard computer. The onboard computer will oversee the final steps in the countdown that includes pressurization of the propellant tanks, in the final 60 seconds of the countdown, as well as the ignition command at T-minus 3 seconds. If all 9 engines light and throttle up to full power and pass their computer health check, the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer will give the command for liftoff, so hold down clamps will release to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical rise from pad 40. Again, liftoff is still set for 7:24 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:24 UTC.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
That latest call from SpaceX Launch Control confirms that kerosene fueling of the second stage is complete, and now we're seeing the so-called big vent from the strong back. This is a chill down and purge and conditioning of that loading line, liquid oxygen loading line, that leads into the second stage in preparation for tanking of liquid oxygen onto stage 2 beginning in a few minutes. Two minutes, 17 minutes, 30 seconds, a little more than a minute away from the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. As you can see, there's a little bit more ground fog building up here at Kennedy Space Center and at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this morning as we approach the time of sunrise. We're about 10 minutes away from sunrise right now here locally on Florida's Space Coast. Liftoff 17 minutes away. So launch will be occurring approximately 7 to 8 minutes after sunrise. We've seen the end of that big vent now, and that should coincide with the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage. Now 14 minutes, 30 seconds remaining in this morning's countdown. Here's a look at the expected ground track for this Falcon 9 rocket after it lifts off from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. This red line shows the approximate trace of the ground track for the Falcon 9 as it heads northeast from Florida Space Coast out over the Atlantic Ocean.
Spacecraft is on internal power.
We just heard confirmation that the GPS-3 SV-06 navigation spacecraft is now on internal power. So the GPS satellite that's buttoned up for launch on top of the Falcon 9 is now in launch configuration. Back to this map, we've labeled here the location of Space Launch Complex 40 here at Cape Canaveral, as well as the location of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas about 400 miles downrange, floating in the Atlantic Ocean, a couple hundred miles due east of South Carolina. That's where the first stage booster will be landing about 8 minutes after liftoff, while the upper stage continues on a track northeast, flying roughly parallel to the east coast of the United States. This is a ground track that is commonly used for the Falcon 9 rockets and other rockets that launch from Cape Canaveral, hauling GPS satellites into orbit. The GPS satellites orbit at an inclination of 55 degrees to the equator. A very similar inclination, slightly higher inclination than the International Space Station, which also you have to launch to the northeast from here in Florida to reach that orbit as well. So if you're along the east coast of the United States, you may have a chance to see the Falcon 9 as it lifts off at sunrise. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 10 minutes and counting. Now 10 minutes away from liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with the GPS-3 SV-06 navigation spacecraft on board from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This GPS satellite will be the 6th in the Space Force's GPS-3 series of upgraded GPS satellites. These follow up on the previous generations of GPS satellites by adding new navigation signals, more precise position and timing estimate capability, as well as a longer lifetime for these satellites. These satellites are designed to operate for 15 years. The earlier generation satellites were designed to operate for about 7 years, although many of those far outlived their design lifetime specification. Here are a few images. On the left is an artist concept of what the GPS-3 spacecrafts looked like in orbit, and on the right are some images from Lockheed Martin's clean room from Lockheed Martin's factory up in Colorado, where these GPS-3 satellites are produced and integrated and tested and then stored until they're needed for launch. This satellite will be replacing an aging GPS satellite in the fleet, and the Space Force calls up satellites as needed from storage and prepares them for launch to replace aging satellites that are near the end of their lifetimes. You can see as the countdown is now 8.5 minutes from liftoff, we're now almost a few moments from sunrise here at Kennedy Space Center. If you're just joining us, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, and we're covering the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with the GPS-3 SVO6 spacecraft. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our stream. That helps us get more people following us and more people tuning in to our launch coverage. So please hit the thumbs up or like button here on our stream. Now T-minus 8 minutes and counting. Now seeing the first rays of sun peeking over the eastern horizon here at Kennedy Space Center as SpaceX's countdown is now at the T-minus 7 minute mark. At this point in the countdown, engine chill down should be getting underway. This is the thermal conditioning of the 9 Merlin 1D engines at the base of the Falcon 9's first stage. This protects the engines. This chill down, protects those engines from the risk of thermal shock at engine startup. At T-minus 3 seconds, and we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the engine chill down is underway. T-minus 6 minutes 40 seconds. Also at this point in the countdown, the autonomous flight termination system on the Falcon 9 rocket is being confirmed ready for launch. That's the self-destruct system that would be activated to terminate the flight and essentially blow up the rocket if it flies off course on the way into orbit this morning. An unlikely occurrence. But that flight termination system is part of the range safety system and is there to ensure public safety as well as safety of property in the event of a launch mishap. T-minus 6 minutes 4 seconds. In the next few moments, the kerosene tank on the first stage should be fully loaded.
Stage 1 fuel load is complete.
You just hear the call that the Stage 1 fuel load is complete.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for strong back retract.
T-minus 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The next major milestone will be the retraction of the strongback out at pad 40. That will retract about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 vehicle, and we should see that quite clearly in this camera view.
Strongback retract has started.
Strongback retraction now underway. This begins with the opening of clamps that are wrapped around the upper stage of the Falcon 9. Once those clamps are open, the strongback will be free to retract that to that 1.5 degree angle. T-minus 3 minutes, 30 seconds. You can see that strongback is retracting. There's now a larger gap in between the strongback and the rocket. The first stage for this mission is booster 1077. It's actually making its second flight to space after launch back on October the 5th with the Crew 5 mission for NASA. This rocket boosted 4 astronauts on their way to the International Space Station and is making its second trip to space this morning.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
T-minus 2 minutes, 50 seconds. Here's a quick look at the launch timeline. About 2.5 minutes for the first stage burn. That first stage will be returning to the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas out in the Atlantic Ocean. That landing is expected around 8 minutes after liftoff. About the same time, the second stage will be completing its burn to place the GPS satellite into a preliminary orbit. But another burn will be still to come at T plus 63 minutes. That'll be a 44-second burn to boost the GPS spacecraft into a higher orbit, setting up for payload separation at 1 hour, 29 minutes after launch.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
T-minus
Ground
1
gas
minute,
close up.
18 seconds. Falcon 9 now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants. Coming up at T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will be passed from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer. T-minus 60 seconds, Falcon 9 now in control of the countdown. Propellant tanks will be pressurized to flight levels shortly.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
This is the mission director. Go for launch.
T-minus 20 seconds. Engine ignition will be occurring at T-minus 3 seconds. Launch director has given their final go for launch. T-minus 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket carrying the GPS-3 SVO-6 spacecraft into orbit. Nine Merlin engines powering the Falcon 9 into orbit, heading northeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. T plus 1 minute. Falcon 9 now passing the speed of sound. And Falcon 9 is now past max Q. That's the phase of the flight with the maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Nine Merlin engines continue powering the Falcon 9 downrange, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust, burning rocket-grade kerosene along with liquid oxygen. About a minute, less than a minute now remaining in the first stage burn. T plus 2 minutes, everything looking good. All reports from SpaceX Launch Control indicate a smooth flight so far. Now about 10 seconds remaining in the first stage burn. That'll be followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. There's the main engine cutoff. Looks like we have stage separation, and we see the plume and exhaust confirming ignition of the second stage of the Falcon 9. We're going to switch over to SpaceX's feed now. These views come from SpaceX showing onboard camera views. On the right is a camera looking at the engine bell of the second stage Merlin vacuum engine as it's continuing its burn to power the GPS navigation satellite into orbit. On the left is a long-range tracker showing the second stage continuing to fire from a perspective from a ground camera. And there you see on the right payload fairing separation, revealing the GPS-3 SV06 spacecraft to the environment of space for the first time. This SpaceX feed comes with a little bit of a delay. Looks like about 15 seconds or so. This is pretty typical for these SpaceX feeds. A downrange tracking station in Bermuda is now receiving signals from the Falcon 9 as it makes its way into orbit. The first stage is making its way toward the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas about 400 miles or 650 kilometers northeast of Cape Canaveral. And in this split-screen view from SpaceX on the left, you see an onboard camera shot from the first stage booster, now at an altitude of 114 kilometers and descending. It's reached the high point of its trajectory this morning.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
And the next major milestone will be the start of the entry burn on the first stage. That'll be using 3 of the first stage the 9 engines on the first stage. 3 of those 9 engines will fire for a retro burn to slow down for re-entry back into the atmosphere. That's about a minute away.
Stage 1 FTS is safe.
Stage 1, entry burn startup.
We now hear confirmation that the entry burn is underway on the first stage booster. See that visually.
Stage 1, entry burn shut down.
And there's cutoff of the 3 engines on the first stage. Entry burn is now complete.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Descending through 32 kilometers and about 5,300 kilometers per hour. Second stage, meanwhile, is continuing to accelerate up to orbital velocity. About a minute remaining until landing of the first stage. That'll be occurring nearly simultaneously with the shutdown of the upper stage engine to place this GPS spacecraft into its preliminary parking orbit.
Stage 1, transonic.
Stage 2 has
stage.
entered terminal guidance.
Now passing below the speed of sound.
Stage 2 FTS is safe.
Stage 1, landing burn.
Now seeing landing burn underway.
Seco.
News from the first stage showing that landing burn underway. Signal does seem to be a bit intermittent, not surprising. Now the video feed is back, as well as a feed from the drone ship, standing by for landing of the
Landing
first
deploy.
stage.
Stage 1, landing confirmed.
Touchdown. Booster 1077
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
has arrived on the deck of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas out in the Atlantic Ocean. This completes the second flight to space for this booster.
Nominal parking orbit.
SpaceX confirms a nominal parking orbit. It's a critical milestone, so GPS 3SV06 is now in its preliminary orbit, a low altitude orbit.
And acquisition signal, Newfoundland.
And the rocket will be coasting in this orbit for nearly an hour, about 54 minutes or so, until a restart placed the spacecraft into a higher orbit, closer to its final operating orbit, and that will set the stage for deployment of the GPS 3SV06 spacecraft at T plus 89 minutes.
And expected loss of signal, Bermuda. And expected loss of signal, Newfoundland. Acquisition of signal, Goonhilly.
Now 17 minutes 40 seconds since the Falcon 9 rocket lifted off from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. The upper stage of the Falcon 9 is orbital. It's over the North Atlantic Ocean, passing just south of Greenland and Iceland, soon to head over parts of northern UK, then northern Europe, making a southeast track across Eastern Europe and then over parts of Asia. First stage made a successful landing on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, about 8 minutes after liftoff. That completed the second flight to space for that booster, Booster 1077, SpaceX's fleet. Another hour and 10 minutes to go until the GPS-3 SV06 spacecraft is deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket into its targeted orbit this morning. Another engine firing also still to come on the upper stage. That engine will be reignited for about 44 seconds in about 45 minutes from now. So in about 45 minutes, that engine will light for 44 seconds. That will boost the orbit higher and set the stage for the deployment of the GPS spacecraft again at T+1 hour 29 minutes into its final, its targeted elliptical transfer orbit. Its final orbit will be circular. GPS spacecraft will have to use its onboard propulsion to reach that orbit over the coming days and weeks. We're going to end our stream here, our dedicated commentary stream, momentarily. We'll continue updates on our 24/7 Launchpad live stream on our YouTube channel over the course of the next hour or so on the remainder of this morning's mission. Before we leave you, we want to take a look at some of the launches we're covering in the next few weeks. Looking ahead, just tomorrow, another Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with the next batch of 51 Starlink internet satellites. That launch is currently set for about 7:23 a.m. Pacific time or 10:23 a.m. Eastern time. On January the 23rd, next Monday, Rocket Lab will be making another attempt to launch its first mission from U.S. soil. That launch will be based out of Wallops Island, Virginia, at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, with 3 Hawkeye 360 small satellites on board. Also next week, a Japanese H-2A rocket is set to launch from the Tanegashima Space Center in Japan with the IGS Radar 7 payload. That's an information gathering satellite, intelligence gathering satellite for the Japanese government. And then in early February, SpaceX is set to launch a communications satellite for the Spanish company Hispasat, again from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. We expect there to be at least one, perhaps more, Starlink launches on Falcon 9 rockets from here in Florida later this month between this mission and the Amazonas Nexus mission in early February. However, we don't have launch dates for those quite yet, so we're not including them on this list. We don't have a firmed up schedule for those. Also, later this month or in early February, there may be another Starlink launch from out in California as well. We're going to wrap up our coverage again on this stream, but hop over to our Launchpad live stream. We'll continue our commentary there for the next hour to hour and 15 minutes while we await the final maneuvers with the upper stage as well as the deployment of the GPS navigation satellite into orbit. I'm signing off from this stream. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. Thanks for joining us. Also a big thank you to Stephen Young for our video and production support this morning. Continue our coverage on Launchpad Live. Great day.